I'm sort of a little bit sad about the fact that there is this absolutely monumental time when you realize how many of your close relatives, your neighbors, your friends were just not there anymore. I was born in Budapest, 17th of June, 1932. One of my first memories is waking up on a warm summer's night in a house in a place called Roman Baths. And this is where my father taught me how to swim. I was 4 years old. And this pool was very interesting because it didn't have tiles. Everything was clay. So I put on this little red coat and went out into the garden and looked at the sky. And I had a very strong feeling that's where I belonged. I had exceptional parents who were exceptionally nice, but totally different from one another. My father was born on the 14th of May, which is an important date for me as a Buddhist person, because Buddha's birth was round about the same time. He was a Buddha-like man. He was a sweet, wonderful, beautiful man. And I think that his kindness was a very important part of my life. My father's name is Eugene, but in Hungarian it's Jenő. He had a very large birthmark on his nose going down onto his face, which was a pretty vivid red. He was born in a township called Eger, which was a very important Catholic city. Now, Eger was a very important part of Hungary because it produced great wine, which they called bull's blood. And I'm not quite sure how, but my father's entire family grew grapes. And out of this growing of grapes, they had a wine, they have grown a wine-making industry. So much so that their wines among the Catholic clergy was very famous because they drank a lot. red wine. And it is our vineyard that grew the wine that the clergy drank. My mother is called Cecilia, and she was named after the goddess of music by her father, who had a beautiful operatic voice. Apparently, I didn't know this from my mother. I heard it from my cousin. He used to sing as a cantor in the synagogue. My brother's name was Robert Martin Havosh. Havosh means snow, snowy, and this always amuses me because I actually dislike the cold. But eventually, I adopted a very staunch belief, philosophical belief in Tibetan Buddhism. And as you know, Tibet is the land of snows. My brother was a very central point in my life because I was a little girl and 7 years younger than my brother. And as he grew up, he looked like a film star. My brother was causing a lot of trouble. And my father was very angry with him, practically all the time. He was like my mother called him the excitable fox. That was his name. But my mother adored him. My brother was a noisy, oversexed, lying, and very nervous person. I know absolutely nothing about my grandparents. I only knew one of them, my father's mother, who was a pretentious, I think not very kind woman who didn't like my mother because she was penniless. I know that I had two cousins who were the two daughters of my mother's cousin. Their mother, whose name also was Cecilia, married a non-Jew, what we called a kind of German that the Hungarians used to call Schwabs. And he was a share broker. And his daughters, my two second cousins, were raped and murdered by Hungarian Nazis, arrow-crossed Nazis. One was only 9 years old, and the other one was about 13. I knew them fairly well. I had two very important aunts. One was my mother's sister, and another whose genes I think I have inherited in a large portion was my father's sister, who didn't like Jews and didn't marry a Jew. Her name was Auntie, Aunt Auntie, but her name was Anna, like Anna Veronica, me. Our name was really, long time ago, Hillinger. I think a lot of Hungarian Jewish people wanted to be not recognized anything else but Hungarians. So if they had a foreign name, they changed it, Hungarianized it. My father was a staunch Hungarian patriot. Now, the great influence in my father's life came from his primary school, because a very important primary school teacher was one of the great writers of Hungarian literature. So I have got most of his books and this man was a fantastic patriot. So my father, probably under his influence, became a fantastic patriot himself. When my father was 18 years old, the 1914 war broke out in August. He was going to go to university with beginning of September. But my father, due to his upbringing, was a man who lived for his country, Jew or not Jew. So he registered for the army. He was 18 years old. He came back, He didn't go to university, missed the 4 years. He then became, I suppose, I don't know the details, but I think, how old was he? He was only 22. So I think he first of all became somebody like a receptionist in whatever. But, and there comes the other side of the story, by this time, my circus princess aunt, Trudy's mother, has seduced a ritual Jew who was the owner of a very vast export and import of furs company, and she became pregnant. What did the old rich man do? He married his nephew to Trudy's mother, my aunt. And they were filthy rich. Members of the whole family was employed in this conglomerate. And this is where my father got his first well-paid job. I don't think he liked it, but he did it well. He was in the office. He became actually a very important part of the office of Glückstalen, weil, but he didn't like it. My father, he was a man of many facets. When it came to me, he would spend any amount of money on my dresses, on my ballet dancing, on my language. I had several different language teachers. I had a violin teacher. All of that. If my mother wanted him to spend some money, she pushed the thing onto me. Any amount of money. It probably spoiled me in a way because I kind of accepted that anything I want, I can have, providing a man is involved. My father actually loved stamps. He adored them. You see, my father discovered that he didn't like to travel, but for some reason, the stamps made him travel. Because you look at a stamp, he had magnifying glasses you wouldn't believe. Every time I'm mucking around with these beads, I remember my father with the magnifying glass. He would call me to his desk and he would say, "Oh, this is Kamchatka." And then he had the globe. He was showing to me where Kamchatka was. And then he would have books where if he wanted to know the details of what was Kamchatka like, it was all in this book. The details were there. Kamchatka was like this. This was the average temperature. This was this was that. He traveled through his stamps. So my father became a professional stamp collector. And then he just started to expand on the exchange of stamps on that international level. And our company was called, my father called it the Icarus. So he had, and this is how in 1938 he got to know another stamp collector in New Zealand who wanted him to come to New Zealand. So his stamps were valuable enough to have to be held in the banks, but secretly. Everything had to be secret. In those days, he was considered, on the stamp business, a millionaire. when my father was interested in something because of its rarity, he would know it. And then maybe he would buy it and put it into the bank for safekeeping, you know. And of course, all those banks were robbed. Everything that belonged to Jews were taken to Germany. I was born after the financial collapse, which was in the 1920s. So I was born in 1932. Now, when my father bought this apartment, because it was an own-your-own apartment, my father bought it and he had money for it. After the financial collapse of 1920s, they had to sell half the apartment. So the original 4-room, bathroom, kitchen, long hallway, balcony was cut in half. My mother had a passion for books. And so we had a very large, quite excessively carved, I can't call it credenza because it was too big for that. It was about that big as from this corner of the wall to the other corner of the wall. And it went in sections, each of which I remember intimately. There was a center part, which was a very beautiful door made out of really fine wood. Behind that door was a kind of space where my mother kept all the fancy, beautiful drinking glasses, and quite a lot of spirits, all kinds of booze, but not wine. So this was all spirits. To the left side of this was a glazed bookcase. To the right side of this was a glazed bookcase. Underneath the bookcases, which stopped about that high, there were drawers. In one drawer, my mother kept her handbags. In another drawer, she kept her silk scarves. On the right-hand side, the family cutlery was kept. Underneath that, assorted things like napkins, stuff like that. Then there was a door, and I don't remember. That was a cupboard too. I don't remember what was in that. But this was a beautiful bookcase. We loved it. It was a treasure. And I read all the books in there.
What sort of books were they?
Because my mother was a great reader of German classics, English classics, Hungarian classics. On that side, which was very close to my father's desk, there were a lot of geographical books, a lot of history books, and a lot of war books. A fantastic amount of books. I mean, that bookcase was the spine of our family. Then my father was a so-called secretary, had a sort of secretary, which was another extraordinary piece of furniture, probably very costly. When you opened it, it had a desk to this side and that side. There were fine little drawers, and he was very fond of things like strange, he loved strange bugs, big ones. And then, of course, lots of stamps. And he also had a passion for fountain pens, which were always gold. But behind all this, and you wouldn't know how, you couldn't even guess, behind all this, which seemed like the back of the secretary, that could be opened only by my father. And this is where he kept his most valuable stamps, broken gold, old gold Napoleonic coins. And the story just follows, you know. It was a treasure trove. At the bottom part of it, there were his stamp collection books, and also a library, a very heavy, each book was very heavy, of all stamps of the world since the beginning of times. On top of that was a clock, which was always a half an hour late. So, then we had a fireplace between the secretary and the corner of the room, which was a burgundy-colored fireplace made out of tiles, which you had to light about 10 o'clock in the morning, every morning. And by the time it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, all the tiles were piping hot. And to the left and the right side of it, there were two armchairs covered in red brocade. My mother was a really fine provider, you know. She, I think, had an idea that she must please my father, and so anything like French cooking was not on. We ate Hungarian food, which she learned how to cook. And we had all the classic Hungarian dishes. So we had, you know, we may have had wonderful chicken soups. We may have had paprika chicken. Once again, I think she was far more Jewish than was my father. So I think pork was often reduced to a minimum. But we still had it. My father loved pork, and my breakfast was, with my dad, lemon tea And my father loved speck, which was frozen pork, frozen and smoked pork fat. And that was put, it had to be very cold, so you can slice it very thin. And we ate that with rye bread. And that is my favorite brekkie to this day, except that I can't buy speck like this. In Europe, the important meal of the day was the midday meal, which we called abed. And when you had dinner, you called that evening. It's an evening meal, and it was not as important as the midday meal. So midday meal, and after the midday meal, everybody had a snooze. So the typical midday meal certainly was, there was always an excellent soup. There was meat, vegetables, potatoes, salad, and compote, which was made out of fruit. Otherwise, sweets were made usually for the weekend. My mother made them. All kinds of wonderful cakes. By the time I was of an age of, the age when you make assessments of your parents and other things, it was always tender and cordial, but the sex was gone. Sex was gone basically because my mother had a number of unwanted pregnancies, which she didn't want. So I think that resulted in probably them sleeping separately. I learned quite a lot of French from my mother, never quite understanding why she speaks some French, because that was sort of kept from me. Nobody told me why, because it was a secret. But certainly these languages we all lived with. She wasn't very Jewish. She didn't look Jewish. Nor did anyone in her family. And she, before she died, she wrote me a letter. And she said that with a few inquiries she has been making, she has found some interesting thing about the Jewishness of our family. That's all. She didn't go into it any further. And then she died. I know that my mother didn't look Jewish. She had, all the three people, my mother, her sister, my uncle, they all had blue eyes. Any Yiddish I know from my mother, and my father. If my father heard she's using Yiddish words, They didn't want to have anything to do with Jews. My mother and her sister spoke German to one another so that us kids wouldn't understand. But we did, because we knew German, because we had the German instructors. You see, you have to know history for this, because Hungary was really occupied by the Habsburgs. So everybody had to learn German in school. German, of course, was a must. If you didn't speak German, you weren't quite right, you know. You were a poor, uneducated sod. French came into it also. My father didn't allow people to use Yiddish words. Yiddish was cut. Don't talk a Yiddish word in the house. But I did learn some Yiddish words from other people. And then the same thing happened many years later when the Nazis were beaten and the Russians came. Everybody started learning Russian. So to this day, I know quite a few Russian words. My mother was a very conscientious house of the, what can I say, her house was a beautifully run little orderly place. My mother had a set of beautiful looking porcelain that was only used at Pesach and never any other time, because that was the norm, you know. And that was always put away after Pesach. But my mother came from a Jewish household where my grandfather apparently sang in the synagogue. And my father didn't give a cracker. But he was obedient towards the demands that Jewry made on him, didn't like it, and was not interested. And that's quite definite. He could not practice because my mother demanded that our household was a Jewish household. Pesach was celebrated, Yom Kippur was celebrated, when we had to be, was that not eating? Yom Kippur? Yes. I remember going to the butcher's in the place where we had rented our summer house. We went to this butcher because my father bought his speck from there. His speck was very important to my dad, you know. And I inherited that. So when we went to the butcher's, on the wall, terrible things were written about the Jews. Bloody Jews, this or that. I don't remember the exact words, but I could read. And I said to my father, "What is this? And he said, don't pay any attention. That was the attitude. We didn't move among people who hated us. So my parents had non-Jewish friends. One of my uncle was non-Jewish. Another one later on, who married my auntie, was a Hungarian aristocrat also. So you didn't move with them. You didn't know they hated you. But the big changes came when it was decided that in order to save my life, I must turn and be de-Jewed. In a church not far away from us, run by the world's most delightful man, Dr. Hummel, and he taught me how to be a Catholic and eventually baptized me Catholic. I was 10 years old. The knowledge of the war started when my parents' relatives, friends were talking about it. But I personally didn't feel the effects of the war till quite late. So if the war started to be spoken about by my parents, etc., that would have been in the late 30s, because the Führer became more and more prominent in European history, and you heard his name and him making hysterical speeches on the radio. But actually, us personally, it only started touching us when we realized that the existence of Jews were curtailed. So, and the curtailing came in very quietly in a way, very gradually, and it grew. So one day it was just this thing, and then maybe a few weeks later it was 3 things, and then maybe some weeks later it was even more. So when, for instance, the Jews realized that, I don't know what year it was, that they can no longer go to university, or we, in our teenage years, could no longer go in a so-called grammar school, but to a reduced sort of a school. And that reduced school didn't give you a degree for anything much. So if you graduated from these schools, what would you become? Probably at the best of time, an office person, but you wouldn't ever get a degree of anything. So you see, that's how it was an infiltration into the psyche. So the Jews sort of realized that this is not going to be much fun, because Hitler was getting larger and larger, as if you were watching a movie. And at first the figure in the movie was so small, and then it became a giant, you know, and it went on like this. Now the Hungarians were in a specific situation because politically they aligned themselves to the Germans. I think the idea was if we didn't, the Germans would overrun us. I was a child, so I'm not sure that I am being precise about this. But for sure, because Hungary was a sort of country that people always wanted to run over. And the Germans were the next. So if we didn't align ourselves with Hitler, they would overrun us. Or this is what I think. So people started to be sucked into the army and sent into war. Then Jews were being taken away into labor camps. This wasn't like the later sort of deportations. These were labor camps. So you got a yellow armband signifying that you were in a labor camp for Jews and you did labor, you know. And this was very strongly backed up by a strata of people who we didn't know, the Arrow Cross people. And the Arrow Cross people had a leader by the name of Saloshi. So, and he was a monster, but it took time for him to get a full grip, you know. So by the time the Hungarian government decided that they no longer wanted to support Germany, come what may, and the governor, Horthy, stood up and said, "We want out." It was 1944, and that was only a little way away from the end of the war. So, because I was a child, I didn't fully grasp what was going on. It was not like, oh, if we were Jews, we were starved to death, or we couldn't buy food, or we couldn't go to the tailor, or anything like this. It wasn't like Germany, where in Germany people were beaten up on the street and their shops were demolished, you know. It wasn't like that. But in 1944, when this announcement was made, then the full blast came. And this is, in my mind, in very strong letters stuck up on the wall, the 19th of March, 1944. And you could hear the German army actually coming down the street. The army, boots, guns, and all. Huge sound. And after that, all hell broke loose. Now, it didn't just break loose because of this announcement, but funnily enough, the war accelerated from the Russians coming and wanting to arrive and take over Budapest, and the Americans coming and bombing us without any discrimination whatsoever. So they bombed everywhere. It was what it was, a carpet bombing. It was very frightening. And this is something you can't explain to anybody who didn't go through it, because on one hand, you could hear the Russian guns coming, and they had a special sound, and the Hungarians called these guns Rutsch bombs. When the Rutsch bombs were coming, and they were approaching slowly but surely, and the Germans were beginning to vacate the ground. They went further and further away, and the Americans were bombing more heavily and more heavily. So we got it from the ground, and we got it from the sky, and we got it from the Hungarian Nazis once again on the ground. And the deportation of Jews started. And when people came and started banging on the door at 4 o'clock in the morning, you knew, they're taking my dad, my brother, and they did, In our particular very close circuit, they took 240 healthy middle-aged men and their sons, if they had any, And my mother and I were left in the dark in the early morning, and we said, for Christ's sake, what now? Now, as it happened, my father and my brother were taken to a Czechoslovakian town which served as a Jewish camp in Theresienstadt. And on the way there, my brother jumped off the train. They were packed like sardines. There were no toilets. There was no food. The 240 men in our close circuit, out of the 242 men came back. One was my father, and one was a neighbor. And then later on we found out, or rather earlier on, that my brother escaped into the so-called underground, which was Peace Week. It was a joke. Nevertheless, he had a uniform, a powerful gun when we saw him first, when my father was still unknown and away. My father was there from, I think, 1944 October, and Americans occupied the Jewish camp in Czechoslovakia in August 1945. We at first didn't know. We didn't know where he was. My brother was already at home. He found us, and we were living at first in our bombed out apartment, which was leaking snow, and everything was stolen. They couldn't take that big bookshelf. Um, my brother was very good. He was very good. It was marvelous to have him there. He became a man. First of all, I got a terrible infection on my eyes, which could only be cured by vitamin C injections, which we didn't have. And he went into a hospital and stole them, give them to the doctor. My eyes were so bad I couldn't open them. So I was blind, stuck together. The other thing that went on was a terrible sort of shit that everybody got, which was running. You couldn't hold it back. So it was running and running and running. And I remember him going into a very famous chocolate shop, chocolate factory called Flourish. And he stole cocoa. And he brought home the cocoa, and we were all making cocoa to stop the shit. That's what chocolate does, you know. And but it was a terrible thing because this particular diarrhea called Ukrainian, don't know why. I think it was probably called Ukrainians by Russians. Was actually coming from the water of the Danube, because the Danube was full of bodies floating about, and these were by and large a lot of Jews who were taken to the river and shot after they've taken their clothes off. And I've witnessed this with my two eyes. My mother knew that we've got to get out and away from our apartment, because if we didn't, they would come there and take us away and deport us. So we mustn't stay there. And by that time, there was an uncle who somehow got us a so-called Swedish protective letter. And with this Swedish protective letter, we could front up in a house which was a Swedish protected house. But it never stopped the bloody arrow cross. Little bastards, hardly older than 14 and 15 years old. And they made midnight raids on us. So if my mother managed to cook anything for dinner and there was any left over, they stole it. These were the Hungarians. Because of them, I would never go back to Hungary. Never. They were the most objectionable, horrible people. And they're probably mostly all dead by now. And yet, they would have planted the seed in their kids, you know. I think they were the most horrible people, you know. And you're sort of queuing up there, trying to save your skin, queuing up there to get into the ghetto so we could get a night's sleep, because these bastards disturbed us every night in the protective houses. We had 2 protective letters, one from Catholics and one from the Swedes. But you never got an undisturbed night's sleep. And during the day, when you looked out the window, they were killing people down by the river, which we could plainly see. And they were all Jews. And nobody objected. This is why I hate the Jews. You know, we have been in an air raid shelter once, on an occasion, when a big bombing was going on. And these Arrow Cross kids came in and started threatening people at gunpoint. You know, there were a few Jewish men there. They were in their mid-30s or 40s. Nobody said a word. Nobody objected. They got hit, and they got hit, and nobody objected. The heroes were lost. So, you know, it teaches you a whole lot of things that how do you react to these things? And then because of your reaction, how do you feel? You know, and how I feel is that I don't like Jews. And that's very strong. If somebody pops along and I befriend them and then I find out that they're Jewish, okay, it's not that I'll turn them away because they're Jewish, you know. But I certainly won't like anybody because they're Jewish. How could this happen? I always remember this time being in this particular air raid shelter, and these 14, 15-year-old boys hitting these strong and healthy men. They don't react. I give my life rather than stand there and take it all. But before that, and when the Russians arrived, there were huge relief and celebrations. The Russians, in many cases, behaved like gentlefolk, although a lot of them were always drunk, because that's the only way they could stand it. In my personal sort of experience, they have always behaved like gentlemen, drunk or not. By the time the Germans went, the schools very quickly try and re-establish themselves. So I started going to school. The bombing, of course, stopped. And on the way from school, there might be a big truck. And a couple of Russian guys would come off. And they would say, "Pici robotni?" That means a little work. So us schoolgirls had to unload trucks and take the parcels to a gate, and then that would be taken inside the building. What was in them, we don't know. But they said this so nicely, "Pici robotni," pici meaning little, robotni is work, etc., etc. They never ever harmed us. Russian ladies started coming from the army, and they were so big. And my mother wanted to get some food, because we had no food. So my mother went to her little corners and pulled out little silk dresses and things. And the ladies melted. They wanted these dresses. It probably would go onto their thigh, but they still wanted it. And they gave us black Russian bread, which was square. So there was all of that. And there was the moment when the Russians first came in, and we were still hiding in the ghetto because we had nowhere else to go. And we were told that the ghetto was undermined. And we were in the ghetto, and somebody said, "Russians are down the street." And we all crowd to these windows high up in the air raid shelter, through which we can see the Russians coming. The first Russian kuchma, you know, the thing they wear. And I was standing on some person's shoulder to be able to see out. Fantastic feeling. I can never hate the Russians, I'm afraid. was an extraordinary feeling. I could never hit the Russians. And before that, of course, in the air raid shelter, all the Polish people, or all the Jewish people in the air raid shelter, started to celebrate. We had nothing but candles because there was no electricity. So the air raid shelters, walls, this would make such a movie. Nobody bothered. The air raid shelters. You know, when wax melts, you can push it to the wall so that till it solidifies, and then it just, you light the candle against the wall. Was fantastic. The entire air raid shelter bathing in lights. And somebody pulled up a violin, started playing the violin. Beautiful. I wish I could make a movie. I'll never forget this, you know. And people were singing. This blossoming or re-blossoming into being alive was such a, I wish I could feel that elation. We lived in an elation. Everything was in ruins, there was nothing to eat. Suddenly the trams started moving. The electricity came back, and we could actually stand by the window and watch the trams go by. Just the sound of the trams, you know. My mother said, "Oh, we're going to celebrate," and I said, "Well, what with? No food." Oh, my mother said, "I've got 2 eggs, and I am going to make a knockadlee with poppy seeds, and I've got a little sugar, and this is going to be made into a celebration dinner." And we had a friend there, and we sat down to this bowl full of knockadlee with ground poppy seed and sugar. Nothing so delicious. And I ate too much. And I thought to myself, it's not nice to be so full. I think this is when I made my decision that I never want to be full, never wanted to be full. But anyway, you know, these are little memories. And then slowly the swimming pool's open because the water was there, gushing up, you know. So these were marvelous times. Even though they were very hard, we still at this moment haven't heard about my father. Somebody did let us know from American sources that he was alive, and he has somehow given some kind of assistance to get him home, along with the neighbor who also remained alive. And they arrived round about late-ish summer, 1945. I remember this so well because the doorbell rang and I was the one who actually went to open. The door had two small windows on each side, which had bar on them. So I remember opening the window on the left-hand side, and there was this unknown man there, but for his birthmark. I knew it was my father, otherwise I wouldn't have known. He was so thin. I'm sort of a little bit sad about the fact that there is this absolutely monumental time when you realize how many of your close relatives, your neighbors, your friends were just not there anymore. My violin teacher, and that beautiful man, you know, he was the most elegant, beautiful musician who played the violin beautifully. Neither he nor his wife. By the time the Germans went out and my father came back and my brother sort of settled in, they've lost interest in my upbringing. They were bashed up by the war, bashed up. There's no mistaken. There's no mistake. There's no mistake about it. It was such a shock to have lost everything that was, for instance, in safe deposits in the bank. Because these people just came and took everything. They stole everything. It was just a legalized looting. It had a system to it. So it was very hard on my parents. My parents were very broken. They were broken-hearted, and I think they were physically exhausted. The energy was killed out of them, you know? And very quietly, I started realizing that there is no future for me if I stayed there. My very important drive was to get away, which I really feared, and yet it was like some force was pulling me. I always wanted to fly. Ever since I saw planes flying by in the sky, I rushed out into the terrace, stared up, and I thought, I want to be up there. How do you learn that? Oh, you go to this club, which was called Ombre, and you say, well, I want to learn flying. Tom was my flying instructor. When I first saw him, what I saw was a sort of a hero from a fairy tale. He just looked like something out of another world. Because in my little head, I thought, I want to be soft. Then I started talking to Tom about it and started to argue about it. We went to elementary school together, primary school, from the age of 6. She was a very brainy person, and she said to me, "You want to leave?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "I'll go with you." By this time, Tom more or less decided that he wanted out too. So we left. It took some weeks of planning, very quietly. I could only have a school bag because it had to look like I'm going to school. My parents didn't know. And I think it was a most terrible shock on everything else that happened to them, you know? So it's the one thing I regret in my life, to have sort of left them. At first, we had no papers, no such thing. We snuck through the border between Hungary and Austria. And we just had enough money to hop onto a bus. And the bus took us to Vienna. In Vienna, we presented ourselves, and we were just schoolgirls. Nobody thought we were anything else. Agi and I. And Tom was just Tom, just a young man. When we got to Vienna, we heard that there was an organization there called Joint, which is an organization for Jewish refugees. And Tom said to me, "Well, let's go to the Joints, but if they don't help, we will go to the Catholics. One or the other." And then from Vienna, we endeavored to get into Germany not because we wanted to go to Germany, we wanted to go to Paris. We lost our way in the Black Forest. And Tom was getting very depressed. And he said, "I'm just going to lie down and die because this is too painful." A wound on the heel of his foot from the boot that he was wearing. And the Black Forest is a frightening place. It is a black forest of huge proportions. And you hear the wolves. And I had to pull Tom. I had to pull him by his good leg. Then we arrived to a village. I don't know what village it was. I do not remember the name. we went to another Catholic priest. It just was a chain of Jews and Catholic priests, you know. I remember when on the French-German border, Tom went to a farmer. Could they allow us to sleep somewhere which is undercover? They put us into a place that had maybe 100 cows in it, and not enough room to lie down. And they shat on us. And then in the morning, they made us a big cup of coffee. But French cups are big, like this. That was nice. But I mean, the cows shitting on us, Tom didn't care. But we had some awful times. Starving. Terrible times. I think Tom and I were the most fertile couple. One blink of an eye, and poof, I was pregnant. Tom has heard that there is a guy in, and I could have who could give me an abortion. A Hungarian doctor who said to Tom, well, that's very fine. I'll give you an abortion, but she's got to sleep with me. And we said no. And that's why Steve's here. And the whole thing was just a mess. Because the French are also very funny people. The French say, oh, you're a refugee, come here, refugees are welcome. But actually, under this welcoming cover, if you happen to get a job, they only pay you half your wage. Tom got very tired. No matter what you did in France, if you were not French, you can't advance. You won't be paid. And Tom said, let's get out of here. I am just me. And I'm a collection of all these experiences which are valid to me. And out of those experiences, I have learned my philosophies, which is once again, they're my philosophies. They're not anybody else's. I really consider myself an individual. If people like it, they like it. And if they don't, I don't care. I aim for being a free person,